and today he will share with us insights available in the book. Peter Lednor grew up in the UK. He holds a Ph.D. in chemistry and worked at the Shell Technical Center in Amsterdam from 1978 to 2009. He's also the author of some 40 academic publications and 30 patents. In May 2010, he founded the Peter Lednor Consulting, focusing on innovation. He has also given courses and lectures on innovation in the Netherlands, the UK, France, Brazil, USA, India, and Kazakhstan for a variety of organizations. He currently lives in the Netherlands. So without further ado, let me hand over the time to Dr. Peter to start the session. Dr. Peter, please.
Thank you, Zara, and thanks to you all for attending. I want to give you some background on my book and to outline the scope and to finish with some concrete things you could do in the workplace after reading it. But before that, I want to start with two questions you might have at the outset. One is, why does the world need another book on innovation? There's already so much out there. And a second one is, why is innovation important to you? So the answer to the first question comes from my having given courses over the last 10 years. And every time I gave a course, I always had a slight concern. Perhaps people know this already, what I'm telling them. But that turned out not to be true. There was definitely an interest in innovation. I didn't need to convince people that it was an important subject. But there was a lot of lack of awareness about what it actually was. Was it different to invention? Could you even manage it systematically? And this was reinforced by something a manager of an HR function said to me in a large multinational company. And he said, we ask our people to be innovative, but we don't tell them how. So there seemed to be a bit of a disconnect between all the information out there and the needs on the within organizations. And perhaps a lot of the information which is available is at too high a level, orientated towards managers or business leaders. And I thought it'd be useful to write a book which was concise, because people don't have a lot of time to read. I thought it should be combine theory, concepts, and practical examples, including case studies, which are in the book. And I thought it should be well supported with literature, not just to substantiate the points in the book, but also to indicate the range of sources which you can use to explore the subject further. So concise theory, examples, and literature. Now, in terms of the scope, early stage innovation covers the journey from idea to proof of concept. You can even start before you have an idea. If you can even start with a blank sheet of paper and then go into idea generation. And it finishes with proof of concept, at which point there is sufficient confidence in the project to invest significant amounts of time and money and to move on to development and launch into a marketplace. Now, across many different areas, it looks as though there's a lot of common features in early stage innovation, and that comes out from the case studies in the book, which offers opportunities to learn from others. In the later stages of innovation, from proof of concept to commercial launch, the journeys tend to diverge, and you can imagine that developing and marketing a nuclear power station is very different to dealing with a new smartphone. But in the first stages, there's a lot of common features. And that's also in these early stages where a lot of young people coming in from universities to an organization will be contributing. Now, I thought that I should have a focus, but it's certainly not an exclusive focus, on people at the start of their careers for the reasons I've mentioned. But I also thought the book might be useful to others, people interacting with scientists and technologists, for example, as business managers or whatever. And so I put "and others" in the title. And I'm pleased to say that that is actually turning out to be true. One recently retired CTO wrote to me and said he actually wished he was still working because then he'd have the opportunity to apply ideas in the book. Another example is a political scientist working at the city of Amsterdam. They have quite a big team on innovation, and he found the book helpful to him and his colleagues, and he's posted a nice review of it online. And then I'm also giving classes on innovation to groups of professional psychologists who are concerned with developing skills around innovation in relation to mental health. So early stage innovation, scientists, technologists, and others. And then the third part of the focus is on people working in organizations. So I'm not directly focused on individual entrepreneurs. And sometimes people in startups have said to me, well, we're 5 people, we know exactly what we're doing, we trust each other, we're all on the same wavelength, we don't need processes and all this stuff, systematic approaches, which might be true. But if you're orientated, if your ambition is to go for growth, what works well for 5 people will be much more difficult without any guidelines with 50 people, and near enough impossible with 500 people. So it's good to be aware right at the outset and prepare for the future before it arrives. Now, the book has been shaped by my giving courses to a variety of audiences in different countries. And I started every course by going around the room and saying, just give me one question you have or something you always wanted to know about innovation. And collecting these questions over quite a lot of courses helped give me an idea of what people wanted to know about. And these questions tended to fall into recognizable patterns. People wanted to know, is there a definition of innovation? Is there a systematic approach you can use? What's the difference to invention? So I got to recognize a lot of these questions, but sometimes their questions would be quite unexpected. And I still remember somebody putting up their hand in the middle of a talk and saying, if I teach my young children a new way to eat their vegetables, is that an innovation? Well, by the end of this webinar, you might have an idea of how to answer that. And you should certainly be able to answer it if you read the book. But if you want to take a shortcut, feel free to answer it, to ask the question in the Q&A session at the end. Just as in the courses, I'd like to emphasize that there are no silly questions in innovation. It's not an absolute black and white, right and wrong. So feel free to ask anything. Now, in addition to the courses, the book builds on my experience as an innovation program manager, developing new programs in innovation and supporting projects, my experience as a project manager, and my experience as a scientist. And I mention this because not everybody who writes about innovation or talks about innovation necessarily has that experience. And as one VP of an innovation at an engineering company said to me, you've seen the blood and you've got the scars. Well, I'm pleased to tell you that that's not literally true, but it does make the point that innovation is not all warm and friendly and fuzzy and fun, although that is actually part of it. There is enthusiasm and passion for ideas, but also disappointment. Projects don't develop in the way you hoped, or funding is terminated. And this can lead to disappointment or even conflicts. So there is a chapter in the book about behaviors, teams, communications and learning, the so-called soft issues, which will help you prepare before you actually find yourself in a situation like that. So having given you some background on the book and said why we need another book, the second question is, why do you need to know about innovation at all? Well, I think the answer to that comes from a quote by Peter Drucker some 20 years ago, and he was a very well-known author, academic, and consultant on innovation. And he said, all organizations, not just businesses, need one core competence: innovation. And we see this playing out today with the constant flow of news about innovation and all the different parties who are involved in it. So not just businesses with new products or services, new or improved, but also governments are very active in stimulating innovation at a national level, at a regional level, at a local level like cities, and also in supranational programs such as those of the European Union. As well as that, universities are concerned with teaching innovation and understanding it as an economic phenomenon. And beyond that, there's all the big societal challenges which are facing us: energy, climate, food, water, health. And innovation is part of the solution to the problems in these areas, not just technically, but also in forms of new cooperations and new ways of working and new business models. So the chances that you end up in an organization which interfaces somewhere with innovation is pretty high. And your role may be different through your career. You may have a role as an innovator, you may be a customer for innovation, and at some point you might be a manager of an innovation group. So with this background of many organizations involved in innovation and various roles that you could play, it's useful to have an awareness of concepts and systematic approaches. And this will allow you to help develop conversations, productive conversations on innovation in your organization. It'll allow you to initiate new approaches or improve ones that you already have. And it will allow you to learn more from your own examples and to learn more from others. So all in all, I hope the book will provide a context for the news flow in innovation and a foundation for whatever new developments come up. So I'd now like to move on to some illustrative points. And I've called these illustrative points, not key points, because what you see as key points will change in the light of your experience. So these are just some illustrative points from some of the chapters. And I'd like to start with something on concepts. I think it's really important for people working in an organization to have the same idea about what innovation is and what it isn't. And this is a topic which had was met with quite a lot of confusion amongst the participants in my courses, and you also see that in the wider world. People use the word innovation quite indiscriminately, and I know of one author who said he'd written 4 books on innovation before he'd even considered a definition. And then he found a list of 25 definitions, some of which were mutually exclusive. So I've looked at various definitions, and the one I've chosen to use in my book, which is not from me, is that innovation is the successful exploitation of new ideas. So there's only 4 words you have to remember: successful exploitation, new ideas. So new ideas, something new, which can also be an old idea in new circumstances. Exploitation is a bit more proactive, a bit more edgy than just implementation. And success depends on which particular area you're in. Numbers can vary widely. For example, if you're developing and selling very high-end brain scanners, you're probably talking only about a few per year. If you're talking about new smartphones, obviously many, many more. So the definition helps to determine what is an innovation and separates it from an invention or a prototype. It's got to go through to success in the marketplace. Another nice feature of this definition is that it covers both technical and non-technical innovations. So if you're a large organization with new business models, for example, as well as new technical discoveries, you can use the same language to cover both. You can also unpack the definition a little bit more. For example, by questioning what does new actually mean can lead to some very productive conversations. It can lead you to a discussion of how new and the difference between radical innovation and incremental innovation. And I can comment further on that in the Q&A session if you like. It also raises the question of new to whom, because different people can have very different ideas about what new means. So for example, the Nobel Prize Committee has got quite different views on new scientific newness compared to some patent authorities. So always ask, if somebody says they've got something new, to whom is it new? Is it new just to you, new to your organization, or new to the world? So that's a little bit around the importance of shared concepts and an illustration with the definition of innovation. I'd now like to say a little bit about processes to stimulate innovation. And the reason to have some sort of process in place is because innovation is too important to leave to chance, and certainly leaving it to chance in a world which depends on increasingly on multidisciplinary teams who are geographically dispersed with different backgrounds. So you need a process in place to help guide things along. But remember that processes are a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. So if you do design a process, don't fall in love with it too much. And secondly, remember that processes are sort of like an idealized model. Reality is more messy. It doesn't always fit. But nevertheless, processes can help increase your chances of success in being innovative. Now, there's some very detailed processes out there offered by consultants or in the literature. I've preferred to keep it fairly simple, about 6 steps. And I'll just comment on the first and the last. So the first is defining the scope for innovation. That's an important discussion on where are the boundaries around which we can innovate or we prefer not to innovate. And remember that those boundaries will shift in time depending on the ambition of the organization and the resources available, and perhaps even on the personalities involved. You can then go through some steps of gathering inputs for idea generation, looking widely at what competitors are doing, what your experts tell you, what other experts tell you, what customers want, some form of idea generation, getting resources to develop the idea, and that can take you into open innovation and collaborating with the outside world. And I can say more on open innovation if you want. And then some process for selecting ideas, the sort of questions to ask, and ending up with a proof of concept. And beyond that, there can, in some cases, be issues of handover and what's called the valley of death. And I'll talk about that more in relation to the case studies. So this systematic approach to processes is covered quite extensively in the 2nd chapter of the book and in the 3rd chapter, which is devoted to open innovation. And that brings me then on to the next topic of the so-called soft issues of behaviors, teams, communication, and learning. This is not the natural habitat of scientists and engineers at the start of their career, but most people with those backgrounds realize the increasing importance of these issues as they have experience of working in an organization. And it's important because early stage innovation combines a lot of enthusiasm with new ideas with a lot of uncertainty about whether the idea is going to be viable. And there can be disappointments, there can be conflicts, so it's good to know about some of the factors involved at an early stage. Let me just illustrate one point, and that's around diversity. Diversity is considered rightly to be important in idea generation, but be careful that you don't just go for a superficial diversity in terms of background, age, gender, location, whatever. It's important to have a diversity of opinion. And this is an issue in large organizations with a strong corporate culture where everybody may end up thinking in a similar way, using the same 3-letter acronyms. So go for diversity of opinion, but then recognize that you've got to manage the differences of opinion, which can sometimes be very strongly held when people are competing for resources. And then that can lead you on into a discussion of what makes effective teams. And Google did a big study around this not so long ago, and they interviewed about 200 of their own teams, and they were expecting to find some magic combination of skills and personalities, which determined whether a team was effective or not. In fact, they found that there was one factor which was by far and away the most important in determining a good team, and that was a feeling of psychological safety. Did people feel comfortable asking questions which might seem awkward or even long ago dealt with? So if you can build a team with this sort of feeling of psychological safety, that will help the performance of the team. And this relates to some much earlier work by an educational psychologist who talked about the importance to support each other a lot in order to be able to effectively challenge each other a lot. So there's some tips there on how to get to a state of a high-performing team, which will help you manage some of the inevitable differences. And that's one example from the chapter on behaviors, learnings, teams, and communication. I'd like to say now a little bit about case studies. People on my courses often asked me for case studies. I couldn't find any which were relevant and useful, so I decided to generate them for the book. That turned out to be actually quite hard work. I had to approach about 25 people or organizations to get 8 case studies, but I was in fact very pleased with the quality of the contributions which came back. And to make it easier, I gave everybody the same set of 14 questions in 6 categories. So there's a lot of information in these case studies because 14 questions times 8 organizations is 112 answers. And the case studies are quite broad because they come from 3 multinationals, 1 company in the small and medium enterprise category, 2 universities commercializing research, and 2 examples of social innovations. But looking across all these case studies and illustrating the point I made at the beginning that there are a lot of common features, I pulled out some themes from this. And one is, how do innovations start? And when you look at the case studies, you see that innovations can start in a variety of ways: by identifying a problem, by wanting to solve a need as a consequence of strategy, by adapting a technology, or seeing opportunities to commercialize scientific research. And I think the message here is that if you're trying to be innovative and you've got one particular approach that you're working on, consider some of these other approaches as an alternative or as a complementary approach. Now, the next point I wanted to comment on is the valley of death. This is where projects are often thought to die when being handed over from one department to another department who's going to take the development further, or maybe from a department to an external partner. And sometimes the recipients aren't as enthusiastic about it as the proponents, as the donors, and things get left on the back burner and eventually just die a slow death in the valley of death. So, and this is quite a big topic in the literature on management of innovation. But what the case study showed was that many of organizations had a strategy to avoid this. So one organization had built in a formal process to manage the handovers. Another organization solved the problem by having the original team stay involved. And in another case, it was a question of timing the handover very carefully and consciously to increase the chance of success. So there are some useful lessons there. And then on behaviors, communications, and teams, all the organizations thought that this was indeed a really important topic, and one that it was important to invest time and energy right at the start of the process, before, or the project, before things got too far. And there were various ways of doing this. Some people built it into the process as part of the project charter to actually work on that. In one case, it was noted how inspiring it was to be able to unite the team around a particular goal, and worked on that. And there was a tip from one case which I'll share with you, and that was to have somebody in the team play the devil's advocate, pointing out the potential criticism and weak points before going broader into the outside world with the team's ideas and results. So the message here is, don't neglect these soft issues. You will encounter them sooner or later. But I would also like to suggest that the case studies you can learn a lot from, but I think the format of the case studies and the questions which I used could help you structure your own case studies and use them to share and learn from in your own organization. Now, having said that, I'd like to come on now to a few things you could do after reading the book. I've already talked about why we need another book, or why I think we need another book, and why you need to know about innovation. And I've illustrated the content with shared concepts and process and soft issues and case studies. Let me just say now what you could do in the workplace right away after reading the book. And this is largely about, as first steps, starting discussions in your organization on some of the things I've been talking about. And these can be formal discussions in meetings or whatever, but also informal lunchtime discussions around things like, do we have the same ideas about innovation? Do we have the same definition in practice? Are our processes capable of being improved with ideas from the book? Are we handling behaviors, teams, and communications in the most optimal way? And the answer is almost certainly not, but are there tips in the book which can help you? And can you learn from the case studies? And can you use the structure of the case studies and examples to generate your own case studies? And that will help you learn and develop skills as an organization. And building on this last point, I'd like to finish with a quote about the importance of learning, which says that sustainable advantage in innovation comes from learning from your mistakes more quickly, more effectively than others do. So innovation is a risky business, and you will make mistakes. And by the way, not innovating is riskier still. So try to learn from your mistakes and help your organization develop stories about what went wrong as a way of learning and improving for the future. Having said that, I hope that attending this webinar was not a mistake, and that you've been able to learn something from it. And I hope that you will have the opportunity to read the book and learn even more. So that was it. Thank you. And with that, let me hand back to Zara, who's going to manage the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Lednor, for the informative and insightful talk. I certainly enjoyed it. We will now begin the Q&A session. We have a few questions. The first from Ariel Lim. He asked 3 questions. First, how does innovation help people in the midst of the current pandemic? The second question is, what is the innovation process in the gaming industry? And lastly, is scientific research done for gaming, IT industries, etc. involved in innovation? What's your opinion on this?
Well, with respect to Corona, I've heard one consultant say that innovation is now on the back burner. Everybody's concentrated on getting through the Corona crisis, maybe developing, switching product lines. Johnson & Johnson switched this summer, for example, from manufacturing suntan lotion to manufacturing more hand sanitizer. So people have had to make big changes in product lines, and people have also got to be thinking about reconfiguring the workspace and doing more virtually. On the other hand, there are clearly more opportunities with using digital platforms, and just look at the companies which are doing well and are having to increase their capabilities in online deliveries and logistics. So there is room for innovation still, and there is always room for innovation when it comes to cutting costs and working more efficiently. Now, as to your other questions, with respect to gaming, this is not something I've had any direct experience of, so I'm sorry, but I can't help you there.
Thank you, Dr. Lednor. The next question from Guy Soo Kim. He asks, I think that the innovation ideas come from customers. We can read their needs and wants. What do you think about this?
The voice of customer can be important, and it's always useful to listen to customers, but customers don't necessarily know what they want, or they might have a wrong idea about what they want. And for example, Steve Jobs said, it's not up to the customer to know what they want, it's our task to show them. And this relates to something called latent needs. These are unarticulated needs. People may not know what they want and may not only be vaguely aware of a need not fully articulated until somebody else supplies them something which meets that need. And people can also have a completely wrong idea about what they need. Henry Ford, when he was developing the first mass-produced automobiles, people said that if I asked my customers what they want, they would have said faster horses. So people don't always have a clear idea of what they want, and sometimes they have a wrong idea of what they want. And with respect to mobility, you can see nowadays, do people really want to own a car, or do they want to have access to mobility through a shared service, for example? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Leitner. Thomas Semple asks, what are your thoughts on open innovation versus internal innovation? Is one better than the other?
Thank you. Well, open innovation has been a big topic the last 15 to 20 years, stimulated by the writings of Henry Chesbrough, who's a professor in California, University of Berkeley. I think nowadays, I would say that for every project or activity, it's worth asking, can we do this better or faster or cheaper with external partners? In some cases, there may be very good reasons to keep developments within a company if you have a particularly strong proprietary position and you know more than the outside world. But I would recommend for always asking yourself, can we do this better, quicker, or faster externally? But do remember that open innovation requires a lot of effort. There have been some very enthusiastic proponents of open innovation, and I don't think they always realize how much effort it can be to set up external contracts covering IP issues, for example, and that's particularly so when you get into multi-party consortia. So setting up external contracts can be a big effort. Another thing which can take up a lot of effort is running competitions to bring ideas in from the outside world. If you do set up a competition, make sure you've got the resources to deal with the ideas which come back in case they're much more than you expected. So yes, I think open innovation should be looked at always. Bear in mind that there are good reasons not to do it, and just think about the effort that it might involve.
So, thank you, Dr. Leitner. We've got another question from Richard Trolley. He asks, could you tell us a little about the difference between radical and disruptive innovation? Sure.
Well, let me add something to that and add in incremental innovation, which is the relatively small steps which you can do with existing business units usually. Don't underestimate the cumulative effect of small steps. That can take you a very long way. Look at the performance of computer chips or solar cells, wind turbines, and so on. Radical innovation are the bigger step outs, and examples which are often quoted are digital photography relative to film photography. Disruptive innovation. Oh, and by the way, radical innovation may require a different type of organization. You may require to split it out and separate it a bit from your core businesses. If you do that, there's a risk that it could be killed relatively easy. So it's kind of a dilemma. Do we have a small unit outside the main organization, but which could be killed off easily, or do we have it under the shelter of the main organization? Now, disruptive innovation is a term which was introduced by Professor Clayton Christensen, and it's a term which is used very widely, and it's kind of lost its meaning since his original ideas were presented. He often used it in terms of small companies coming in at the bottom end of a market and disrupting the market for established incumbents who were focusing on the high end of the markets. And the example he often gave was of Xerox, who was dominant in photocopying machines and focused on very big corporate clients around the world, and didn't realize that there was a big market for home office use, use by clubs and societies, for example. So other companies like the Hewlett-Packards and the Canons and the Epsons came in and established a strong presence there and took a substantial amount of business, which could have been Xerox's. So I hope that clarifies for you the difference between incremental, radical, and disruptive innovation.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Peter. We've got a question from Ariel Lim. He asks, what are the different categories in innovation applicable to daily life?
Applicable to daily life? Well, I talked about the definition, the successful exploitation of a new idea. So I guess you would have to say, can you have new ideas in daily life which are new? And clearly you can. And can you apply them successfully? And I think you can. I think perhaps what you're getting at is, if you just make some change to your personal lifestyle, would that be an innovation? Well, it might be a success as far as you're concerned, but it doesn't really impact the broader world. And this maybe brings me back to the example I said at the beginning of somebody who said, if I teach my children a new way to eat their vegetables, is that an innovation? And I think my answer to that would be partly in terms of new. What do you mean by new? To whom is it new? Is it just your family, or is it new to your country, or is it new to the world? And secondly, can it be scalable? Because if you've got something which is in fact new to the world and can be generalized and scaled up, then you do have a significant innovation. So I would use that example to answer your question.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Ariel Lim further asks, can you share more in depth about exploitation?
Right. Well, some people would prefer the word implementation, taking a new idea and putting it into practice. That's what implementation would mean. But I prefer the word exploitation. As I said, it's a little bit edgier, a little bit more proactive than just merely implementing something, which sounds as though you're following a set of guidelines, a set of rules, and you just do it. Exploitation means you've really got to push forward. There will be resistance often. So it's a kind of a harder, it should have this connotation that this is actually pretty hard work. And as somebody said, innovation is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration.
Thank you, Dr. Peter. We have got a few questions before the session. I'll just read them out. One of them is, how does research and development relate to innovation?
Right, that's a big topic, and it's an important topic, and one which often came up in the courses I was giving. There's quite a lot of confusion about it. A lot of people have a model in their head that basic research leads to applied research, leads to innovation. And if you go to Disney World in Florida, you will see a statue, and it's there's a pedestal, and it says, on the pedestal the spirit of innovation. And the figure on the pedestal is an elderly white gentleman wearing a lab coat and with a test tube, and he's looking at the test tube, and it's almost a stereotype of a chemist doing experiments. No customers, no investors. And by the way, he's not wearing safety glasses either, which isn't a very good image. But it somehow conveys the image that science will lead to innovation. Now, it can do, but not necessarily. Sometimes innovations can start at the customer end, as we've already discussed. Sometimes they can start in the middle, in the applied science. And it's by no means in reality is a simple linear arrow. There's lots of iterations and general messiness. But this image of basic applied commercialization is quite widespread and held by many people. And one author has suggested that the reason that this model maintains itself is that it's quite easy to collect statistics about each of the phases: basic research, applied research, and innovations, whereas the much more complicated models with interactive loops and so on are much harder to quantify. Okay.
All right, thank you. We have got a question from Ariel Lim once again. He asks, does innovation involve in technology world or just customer ends?
I don't think I fully understand that. Does innovation involve the technology world or just customer ends? Yes, technology can meet some customer desires or needs. Could you maybe rephrase the question, Ariel?
Okay, meanwhile, I will ask another question. What do you think makes a good environment for innovation?
Well, you need, I think, to have the things I talked about in place, to have the right processes to select and allocate resources, to have the right cultures and behaviors in place, but you also need management support, and not just verbally. You need it to be followed up with or supported by allocation of resources. I mean, what you don't want is people's management saying, we want you to be innovative and not providing the resources. But I think it's also important that management is visible in supporting innovation, because innovation often has a longer time scale than day-to-day problems, and middle management will, rightly so, often be focused on the more day-to-day problems. So active, visible support by senior management is important. In addition, there's a couple of things, or at least one thing I would mention, which will also help, and that's to get the balance between enthusiasm and objectivity right. You need to have lots of enthusiasm, but you also need to be able to ask the hard questions which can lead to stopping projects, and getting the balance right between enthusiasm and objectivity and getting the right tone is also an important part of creating a good environment for innovation.
Thank you so much for that. So earlier on, Ariel Lim asked a question about innovation in technology. So he has rephrased the question. Yeah. So the question is, what is the innovation stages in technology world? And how is innovation applicable to schooling, working lives, etc.?
Right, well, innovation stages, breaking big projects down into different stages is a well-known approach. And in engineering, having well-defined stages and decision points is very long established. And I think the petrochemical industry was doing this already in the 1940s. Depending on what the area you're in is, you can have more or less stages. Some very complicated projects with a lot of different technologies involved will be much more complicated to administer than relatively simple ones. There are schemes out there called things like technology readiness levels, which was developed for the weapons and space industries, aviation industries and space industries. and they define 9 levels of technology readiness, starting with the idea and going up to full-scale deployment. That's actually been adopted by the European Union at the moment, but I have seen it criticized as in the sense that it hasn't been established that it will be effective outside the world of space and aviation. So we'll see as the EU programs develop how useful that is. Now, is innovation applicable to schooling and working lives, etc.? I would say very definitely, in the sense that you can have things which meet the definition of successful exploitation of new ideas. And clearly, all remote learning would apply here, both in schooling and in office space. And what we're going to see playing out now is getting the right balance between physically getting together, either for schooling or in working lives, and doing things virtually. So that's a very topical point.
Thank you for that, Dr. Peter. Ariel asks another question: is AI and VR applicable in innovation?
There are some experiments going on there. It's not an area I know a lot about, but Harvard Business Review had some interesting examples of showing that of visualizing 3-dimensional objects using a smartphone from a 2-dimensional drawing in a magazine. And you could imagine that the ability to visualize prototypes and share this as in a multidisciplinary team could be very effective.
Thank you for that. We'll ask the last question before we end this session. The question is it better to start with needs or opportunities?
Needs and opportunities. You need both, and very important source of innovation is matching needs with opportunities. A lot of people are motivated by opportunities they see. Always check if the needs are there and if the needs are what you think they are. And remember what I said about the voice of the customer. Needs may not be there, or customers may have different needs. There's something called the better mousetrap fallacy, which is that you can see the opportunity for a better mousetrap, 5% better. But does anybody really want to spend a little bit more money for a better mousetrap if the existing one does a good job? So you need to think about needs if you're driven by opportunities. If you see a need, then it's more a question of exploring ways in which to meet that need. So it's always a question of matching them up effectively. That would be my answer to that.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Peter. And thank you all for attending today. I hope this has been a fruitful session for everyone. Yeah, and see you soon. And if there are any more questions, please feel free to ask in the chat box, and we will address your questions offline with Dr. Lednor. Thank you very much for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.